beginnings of the Polish state go back to the 10th century, when Mieszko I ruled the lands on the Oder and the Vistula. That's where Poland, the country we have today, started. But what happened on these territories earlier, before the 10th century? Legend says that 2,800 years before Mieszko, a people called the Aryo-Slavs, ancestors of the inhabitants of today's Poland, settled here. They came from ancient Elam, a land on the territory of modern Iran. Having established themselves as lords of the lands on the Vistula, they elected Prince Sarmata their king, who founded a dynasty that ruled for nearly 3,000 years over an empire known as Great Lechia. The Lekhites erected some of the biggest cities of the ancient world: Kodan, Gdańsk, Szczyt, Szczecin, and Karodom, Kraków. Over the centuries, they waged wars against the Roman Empire, and at the peak of their power, their dominions encompassed the whole of East Central Europe. It was not until the arrival and baptism of Mieszko that the Lekhite Empire collapsed. When Mieszko came to power, the memory of the Lekhites sank into oblivion. Is that a credible account of Poland's prehistory? Who were the ancestors of the Polish people? From the depths of prehistory. The earliest and only native Polish source of information on what happened on the lands of the Oder and Vistula in antiquity is the Chronicle of Poland by Master Vincentius Kadłubek, who wrote it in the early 13th century, and later became Bishop of Kraków. He writes of a great empire. In Book 1 of his Chronicle, Vincentius identifies the ancient ancestors of the Poles with the Vandals, and thereafter with the Lekhites. Do modern historians find his story reliable? We don't consider Book 1 of Vincentius's Chronicle a historical source at all, because we have no other independent source that gives us information on the same events as those he described. So are myths and legends all we have left with for the history of Poland? Archaeology is giving us more and more data on the people who inhabited the Polish territories thousands of years ago. Information is coming from the material vestiges our ancestors left, which could survive deep underground. So what do we know about the people who lived in what is now modern Poland 3,800 years ago, when Great Lechia is said to have come into existence? One of the most interesting clues going back to those times are the kurgans discovered at Łęki Małe near Śrem. Dubbed the Pyramids of Greater Poland, this cluster of mysterious kurgans is one of the biggest sites of its kind in Europe. Only 4 kurgans still survive. The archaeological excavations carried out here before the Second World War and in the 1950s revealed a set of extraordinary burial. Next to the bodies, there were weapons and ornaments made of bronze, gold, and amber. Some of the bodies also had daggers with bronze hilts, probably the insignia of power. Hence the name princesses' tombs attributed to these burials. The deceased resting in these kurgans belonged to the local ruling class. We don't know who they were or where their headquarters were. But nearby, at Bruszczewo, archaeologists discovered the vestiges of a Hilfort, and in it, the remains of craftsmen's workshops, including a metalworks for bronze casting. Some of the items from the princess' tombs might have been made here. Belfort was not just a center for production, but also for trade. Merchants traveling from the south of Europe to the Baltic coast for amber would have stopped here. Evidence for this trade is provided by the discoveries of Baltic amber in modern Greece for the ancient Mycenaean culture. We have thousands of elaborate artifacts made of amber, and most are definitely Saxonite or true Baltic amber, so these long-distance voyages must have crossed the territory of Poland. Professor Czepreszuk says that nearly 4,000 years ago, the people west of the Vistula had established contacts with the hub of Bronze Age civilization, while the inhabitants of what is now Mazovia and Masuria lived beyond the reach of these epoch-making changes. What were things like in southern Poland? What do the important archaeological discoveries tell us? Since 2010, Professor Marcin Przybyła of the Jagiellonian University has been excavating Zyndram's Hill at Maszkowice on the Dunajec River in the Beskid Mountains, and has discovered a pile of stone debris, the result of a landslide that brought a mighty wall down. The wall ran along the east and north side of the summit, enclosing a settlement with 2 gatehouses. Radiocarbon dating shows the edifices were built about 1700 BC. They're the oldest stone structures in Poland. What were they used for? We may speculate that this place was built to set up a checkpoint to control traffic along a sort of Bronze Age motorway connecting the north of Europe with the southern part of the continent. Who were the builders of these mighty fortifications? Professor Przybyła sees a resemblance between this wall and structures located in what is now Croatia on the Adriatic. The style of the figurines found here comes from the Balkans, and the ceramics are like the pottery made by Ottoman culture communities from the Great Hungarian Plain. The people who built the defense walls of Maszkowice may well have come from the south, or at least southerners, the dominant role among the builders. Did groups of the same people that settled in Maszkowice also come to Trzcinica near Jasło? A community that still used flint tools to build a ring of earth and timber fortifications and dwellings lived on this promontory overlooking the Ropa River. Thanks to many years of excavation carried out here by archaeologist Jan Gancarski, who discovered thousands of vestiges of ancient settlers, we know enough to reconstruct a picture of those prehistoric events. Around 1650 BC, strangers led by a prince with a bronze ice axe were on their way to the settlement. They were clad in rich, colorful apparel and wore jewelry. The question we have to answer is, how did the indigenous people react? Did they put up resistance or welcome and concede to the newcomers? We haven't found any signs of a battle here. Instead, the local people seem to have been fascinated by what the newcomers brought and started learning new skills from them. A new, mysterious art known only to a few: bronze casting to make tools, ornaments, and weapons. The new arrivals were also highly skilled potters, and the shape and decorations on the ceramics they made are still fascinating today. Still a hallmark of quality standing for the people of the Ottomani Fizeshabani culture who crossed the Carpathians and settled first in Maszkowice and later in Trzcinica. Trzcinica and Maszkowice were evidently settlements inhabited by immigrants from the south who joined and mixed in with the local community. It certainly wasn't hostile reception they got here. The Bronze Age was a time of travelers who embarked on migrations over vast distances. At about the same time, the 15th century BC, suddenly a new, still unexplained phenomenon appeared. A people who cremated their dead and put the ashes in urns, which they buried in an urn field. This must have involved a change of religion about which we don't know much. Scholars have dubbed communities of this people the urnfield culture. They settled in places distributed over a vast area from the Bug River to the Iberian Peninsula. Representatives of the urnfield culture inhabiting lands between the Vistula and the Oder are known as the Lusatian culture, believed to have lasted for 1,000 years. Amazing vestiges of the Lusatian culture have been discovered in Lower Silesia. At Domasław near Wrocław, archaeologists have come across a huge urn field with vessels containing funeral gifts next to the urns. What's special about it, that it appears to have been used for a very long time, about 1,000 years, for burials from numerous farming settlements in the neighborhood. They must have moved to a new place fairly often, whenever the soil became less fertile and the pastures lost their richness. But they continued to look after and cherish the urn fields in which they laid their loved ones to rest. The graves of the ruling class stand out from the burials of the common folk. Were interred in wooden chambers with the urn containing the ashes inside, surrounded by funeral gifts in receptacles which were usually painted with ornamentation and symbols reminiscent of ancient Greek art. This ceramic cart is a unique find with a symbolic meaning. It served to carry the deceased to the other world, following the custom practiced by the aristocracies of Western Europe, who buried their dead in real chariots in huge tombs. Perhaps the Domasław urnfield is evidence that the elite of this community was familiar with the burial rites of peoples belonging to the Mediterranean civilization. Were things the same all over the lands of the Lusatian culture? It wasn't a uniform phenomenon all over the territory. It wasn't one nation under one king. Archaeology applies the name Lusatian culture to diverse ethnic groups. The communities inhabiting the area of modern Kujawia were very different from those in Lower Silesia. The Biskupin settlement, the most thoroughly excavated of them and partly reconstructed, gives an insight into its inhabitant. The settlement was discovered in the 1930s and excavated using techniques which were state-of-the-art for those times. Archaeologists excavated the impressive remains of a timber and earthwork rampart and a residential precinct. We know that the fort was built around the mid-century BC. What could the life of its people have been like? They farmed land and bred animals, which they grazed in the surrounding meadows. A wooden bridge led up to the fort, which was situated on a peninsula jutting out into a lake and just a meter over the water level. At the end of the bridge, there was a gatehouse closing off fortifications guarding the entrance to the fort. Inside, there were rows of long cottages arranged in 11 timbered streets. Some archaeologists see the well-ordered arrangements of the buildings as the beginnings of the concept of a town. Between 800 to 1,000 people are estimated to have lived here comfortably in the well-designed dwellings, which accommodated a family and its domestic animals under one roof. Apart from agriculture, the people engaged in fishing, collecting, and craftsmanship. The artifacts discovered here tell us they were potters, tanners, weavers, and horn makers. There are no traces of a Southern European influence on the artifacts made by these people, nor of a local elite. Who were the inhabitants of this place? Could they have been Slavs, ancestors of the Poles? In a way, they were. But it's not a question of whether they were our ancestors in the sense of forefathers, progenitors. Even the Neanderthals were our ancestors. The real question is, when did the Slavs, the people who spoke Proto-Slavic, arrive, and where did they come from? Virtually up to the late 1970s, the prevalent opinion was that Slavs had lived on the territory of modern Poland since at least the Bronze Age. Biskupin was considered a Proto-Slavic fort. But some scholars say that the Slavs did not come until much later, not until the 6th century AD. Which of these claims is right? A debate is going on between historians, archaeologists, and geneticists, but the answer isn't simple because many peoples crossed these territories in prehistoric times. Poland is situated in the part of Europe which anyone who wants to get from the east to the west of the continent must cross, not only leaving genetic evidence, but also settling or taking some of the local people along with them. So, who were the ancestors of the Poles? Let's take a look at the peoples who were still to appear on the lands between the Oder and the Vistula. Some came for a short time as invaders, others stayed longer and lived off the land. But when did the Slavs arrive? The first people we can actually put a name to were the Scythians, who invaded the Polish territories. The Scythians were nomadic Indo-Iranian tribes which left Central Asia in the early 7th century BC and settled on the coast of the Black Sea. From there, they made looting expeditions onto the territories of East and Central Europe. Scythian warriors covered long distances in a short time on their horses, spending almost their whole life in the saddle. In battle, they used long spears and iron swords, but their best weapon was the reflex bow and arrows tipped with triangular metal heads. The Scythians burned and destroyed hillforts, particularly those in the west of Poland in Lusatian culture regions. Did Biskupin fall prey to a Scythian attack? You might think it did because Scythian arrowheads have been found here. Another argument for such a claim is the fact that the people of this agricultural settlement must have lived in fear of attack and built a huge earth and timber rampart to defend themselves. But no signs of destruction have been found in Biskupin, so researchers say it was never attacked by Scythians. Scythian arrowheads could have reached it by way of trade. What really made Biskupin's inhabitants leave was that after 150 years, the water in the lake rose and flooded the cottages. That's how the story of the Lusatian culture stronghold at Biskupin came to an end. But Vycina in the Lubuskie voivodeship is one of many places in western Poland where we have clear signs of Scythian raids. Archaeologists have discovered lots of Scythian arrowheads in the burnt debris of that fort. On the other hand, we don't see any signs of such destruction or of nomadic Scythian raids in eastern Poland. Why didn't the Scythians devastate settlements in the eastern part of modern Poland? Could they have put down roots and settled there? They would have thought that unrealistic, even eccentric, I'd say, but also illogical, because there were no grasslands there, so where would they have grazed their horses, driven their two-wheel chariots and their herds? There's no such place in the region. Yet recently, a discovery has been made at Chotyniec in Subcarpathia, which could disprove that opinion. Archaeologists have come across a site of over 35 hectares in area surrounded by an earthwork rampart. In the middle, they found vestiges of a mysterious circle. Professor Sylwester Czopek of Rzeszów University, who discovered the structure, says it was a zolnik, a place where members of the Scythian aristocracy performed their ceremonial rites. The evidence for this are the typically Scythian artifacts found here: arrowheads with a triangular cross-section and pins with ornamental heads. But the finds proving the claim are over 200 fragments of Greek amphoras, one of which has been almost completely reconstructed. We're even able to say exactly which parts of ancient Greece these amphoras came from. So perhaps the lords of the community living in this stronghold, presumably Scythians, had close associations with the Greek cultural tradition, which they brought to this place. Perhaps the Scythians invaded the western parts of modern Poland, not from the south across the Sudetes, as we have believed up to now, but from the region of Chotyniec. A discovery of Scythian residential structures could confirm this revolutionary theory, so the research is being continued. Were the inhabitants of the territories of Poland at that time? In eastern Pomerania, a new community separated from the people of the Lusatian culture. We don't know what they were called, but they practiced a strange new type of burial. They decided to bury their dead in urns with an image of the face of the deceased on them. No other culture had this idea, so it made them special, with a distinct philosophy and ideology requiring a new technology and new skills. The people practicing this custom were named the Pomeranian culture. Face urns spread to Greater Poland and later to the Middle Oder and Vistula basins. Pomeranian culture groups lived in smaller communities than earlier groups until the 4th century BC. At this time, nomadic pastoral tribes of Iranian origin, referred to as Sarmatians by the ancient historians, arrived in Eastern Europe. The Sarmatians engaged in seasonal migration, driving their herds and living in wagons, but not building permanent habitats. Like the Scythians before, they followed a westward route out of Central Asia, settling the basin of the lower Volga, the area of modern Moldavia, Ukraine, and the Black Sea coast. Their migrations continued for several centuries and finally reached the Danube in the 1st century BC, where they fought the Romans, proving their valor and fighting spirit. Centuries later, their legend received an amazing revival in Polish military tradition. In the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, the Polish nobility espoused the theory that they were descended from the ancient Sarmatians, while the common people came from a native population. The link between the Sarmatians and Poland was supposed to be proved by a map made in the 2nd century AD by the Greek geographer Ptolemy, who labeled the land east of the Vistula European Sarmatia. How he came by this, we don't know. Ptolemy was an armchair geographer. He didn't travel, but only used the rich resources of the Library of Alexandria. We know the ancient Sarmatians have had nothing to do with the lands that later became Poland, maybe just with its eastern borderlands with Ukraine. There is no archaeological evidence for a Sarmatian presence on the Vistula. Instead, we have ample proof of the presence of another people on record in the works of the ancient historians, as they made a major contribution to the growth of European civilization. It was the Celts. The Celts left their original homes, presumably in Switzerland, the south of France, and southern Germany, and spread over the vast stretches of Europe. This was the time when the Iron Age started in Europe. People learned how to smelt iron ore, chiefly dog iron, to produce metal. Soon iron became the basic raw material for the production of everyday tools. The Celts were masters at this. They also produced weapons and invented chainmail. The earliest specimens of chainmail archaeologists have found in Europe are Celtic. A Celtic warrior carried a long, double-edged sword in a metal-trimmed scabbard. He had a bronze, often elaborately decorated helmet, a long spear, and an oval shield. The Celts arrived in the lands along the Oder and Vistula, though not to make war. Alongside the Scythians, the Celts were one of the first peoples to arrive on the territory of Poland whom we can identify. Celtic settlers came from Moravia, Lower Austria, already in the late 5th century BC. They settled in the area between the Oder and the massif of Mount Ślęza. Evidence of a Celtic presence in a slightly later period has been found in other parts of Poland. The Głubczyce Plateau, the sub-Krakowian less lands, and areas along the upper stretch of the river San were the places the Celts were interested in. Some claim they reached Kujawia, but we don't have much data on that. The largest group of Celtic colonists came to Upper Silesia. At Samborowice, near Racibórz, archaeologists have found the remains of a cluster of homesteads, which shows that a fairly large community must have lived here. A lot of artifacts, including glassware, have been retrieved in an excavation project led by Dr. Przemysław Dulemba. The Celts were the ones who introduced the technology of glassmaking to Poland. What brought them here? The predominant soil type in the region is less perfect for crop farming. That was the main reason why they settled here, because at the time, agriculture was the basic livelihood of the Celts. The Celts were animal breeders. They grazed their cattle, sheep, goats, and horses on verdant riverside meadows. For a meat supply, they kept pigs and cultivated crops, chiefly cereals. Not only wheat and barley, which had been grown in the Oder and Vistula basins before, but also oats and rye. It was the Celts who brought oat farming to these lands. They had a huge influence on the local population. They disseminated the use of many artifacts which advanced civilization, such as agricultural tools made of iron, rotary quern stones, ceramics turned on a potter's wheel. It had taken such a long time to become familiar household items. The Celts were also long-distance traders and introduced a monetary system using coins which were cast as well as the earlier hammered type. Their heyday on the territory of what is now Poland lasted from the mid-3rd century to the early 2nd century BC. The indigenous population learned many new skills from them. The rich Celtic culture had an afterlife here even when they left, and continued until the 5th century AD. The Celts were missionaries of a new culture, a new technology, a new philosophy. Everything was new. They sort of watched over the primitive native population, disseminating their innovations and exerting a huge influence on the culture of Central Europe. What happened to the Celts who lived here? It is generally believed they left for the south in the 2nd century BC, under the impact of a migration of Germanic tribes from Scandinavia. Why did the Celts give way to the Germanic people? The Germanic tribes could not vie with the Celts in terms of culture, but they did have a special feature. They were very well organized politically. Roman historians called the Germanic tribes in the Vistula Basin in the 1st century AD the Lugian Federation. What exactly did they mean? The Germanic tribes inhabiting what is now central and southern Poland, and perhaps lands further to the southeast, parts of northern Ukraine. Most of the Germanic peoples arriving here were Vandal tribes, originally from southern Scandinavia. As they moved south, some of the Vandals reached the Oder and Vistula basins, probably in the 1st century BC, and gradually settled in today's central and southern Poland. They stayed for hundreds of years. No one could have foreseen what a big contribution they would make European history. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of what is now Poland came within the sphere of influence of Republican Rome, which in 27 BC transformed into an empire. The Roman legions were superbly organized. Their excellent tactics and strict discipline made them the best army of the ancient world for several centuries. Their trademark was the gladius, the Roman short, double-edged sword. The Roman legions vanquished tribe upon tribe, gradually conquering all the lands around the Mediterranean. The Romans set their empire's northern frontier along the Danube and the Rhine. They called the peoples living north of that line barbarians. This also meant the inhabitants of the Oder and Vistula basins, yet they still pursued their interests with the people of the Barbaricum. Relations with Rome intensified from the reign of Nero, when we get records of amber expeditions.
Informacje źródeł pisanych o wyprawie pobórskim.
For the Romans, the amber route started in Aquileia, on the coast of the Adriatic. From there, merchants sent their expeditions north along a Roman road across the Alps to the fortress of Carnuntum on the Danube. Scholars are still debating on the exact route or routes amber merchants took from there for the Baltic coast. Was amber all that Roman merchants were interested in? Perhaps they also bought iron for the legions. Archaeological research shows that, at the time, our part of Europe was the biggest center for the production of iron outside of the Roman Empire. There were foundries in the Holy Cross Mountains and in Mazovia, in the environs of Pruszków and Milanówek. Could it be that they produced weapons for the Romans?
Produkcja nasza, lokalna, żelaza.
The local foundries used poor quality ore.
I w piecach, które nie mogły osiągać.
So there are no grounds to believe they produced iron for export to Rome.
Mówiąc o eksporcie żelaza na tereny Cesarstwa Rzymskiego, nie mają żadnej racji bytu.
Nonetheless, the local population traded on a regular basis with the provinces of the Roman Empire. Proof of this comes in the diverse archaeological finds, such as Roman coins, fibulae, a fashionable type of clasp, pottery decorated with scenes from Roman mythology, glassware, and other artifacts. These items were found in a burial ground at Kowalewko near Poznań. Genetic tests were carried out on the bodies and gave a result hard to imagine, considering the transport facilities available in those remote times. It turns out that human mobility and genetic exchange was just the same 2,000 years ago as it is now. They had open populations, people traveled, and new genetic material reached our part of the world all the time. What other new arrivals did we get? In the 1st century AD, new people crossed the Baltic in search of a better life. The mysterious burial ground and henge near the village of Odry in the Bory-Tucholskie forest shows that they lived in Pomerania. The site contains 29 kurgan burials and 10 stone henges, which has indeed been dubbed the Polish Stonehenge. It was made by the Goths, who came from Scandinavia. What did they build it for? One of the popular theories says these henges served as astronomical observatories. The henges are distributed at points in a geomorphological arrangement, which rules out skywatching, so it couldn't have been astronomical observatories. So why did the Goths mount such an unusual assembly of stones on the last resting place of their loved ones? To my mind, for the Goths, this burial ground was like, say, a sort of culture center, a headquarters for the ruling class or a business corporation, where they took all the important decisions in the presence of their deceased. In the mid-2nd century, Some of the Goths left Pomerania, northern Greater Poland, for unknown reasons, and moved upstream on the right bank of the Vistula, heading for Ukraine and the Black Sea. On the way, they would have passed territories inhabited by the Vandals, another Germanic people who had arrived a few centuries earlier. The Vandals inherited the cultural legacy of the Celts and, like them, made a living from craftsmanship and agriculture, not war. The Goths that came down from the north were a threat to them. Did these two Germanic tribes fight each other? There's just one place in the world that shows there was a war waged between the attacking Goths and the Vandals, and this indeed is an unusual phenomenon. It's a stretch of land east of the middle course of the river Wieprz out towards Podolia. In the area of modern Hrubieszów, archaeologists have come across vestiges of this war. The Vandals lost, and those who survived had to leave the area and return to the center of their territory, on the west bank of the Vistula. The group of Goths who beat the local Vandal inhabitants stayed in the Bieszów Depression, the valley of the Bug. The area had a specific continental climate, and the local soil was one of the best in this part of Europe. That's why they stayed. How do we know? Excavations on the outskirts and in the environs of Hrubieszów have brought to light a series of burial grounds, settlements, and craftsmen's workshops. Thousands of artifacts have been found: combs made of horn, fibulae, including rare specimens shaped like a duck, necklaces made of glass and amber beads, Roman coins, and glass goblets. By 1985, we knew these people were Goths. It was a big sensation because no one had expected to find Goths in the region of Lublin. Our excavations showed that the biggest cluster of Gothic newcomers was in what's now Masłomęcz. This place might have been their capital. Maybe what's most amazing is the size of this settlement, or in fact town, because there could have been as many as 120 cottages in it, as impressive as this one. Their cottages had all mod cons, you might say, 200 square meters of floor space in a well-ventilated, practically air-conditioned building, and with central heating, which I found most amazing. The main occupations of the Goths of Bieszów were crop farming and animal rearing. Craftsmen were important members of the community too, at hornmakers, blacksmiths, and jewelers' workshops. They produced ceramic vessels, some using a potter's wheel. Weaving and making garments was a job for the womenfolk. The community welcomed strangers, so they were visited by members of other communities and trade flourished. What was the setup in this community? Who governed it? Archaeologists wanted to get answers to these questions by examining the burial grounds. The biggest one they discovered was on a hill overlooking the valley of the Bug. There, they excavated hundreds of burials. What they found most astonishing was the fact that there were hardly any male skeletons. and the female burials were absolutely shocking. In many of the women's graves, parts of the body, the head, the torso, or the limbs were missing or had been moved to another grave. They must have a philosophy of life and death that told them to ritually and recurrently open women's graves and cut up the bodies. How much barbarity there was in what we observed, and how much must be attributed to our lack of knowledge what it all meant to these people. It couldn't have just been simple vandalism, but a complex system qualifying certain women for this ritual, as some of the female bodies had been buried intact in the normal way. In one of the graves, there was a girl in a sitting position, propped up against the back of a wooden litter, with the skulls of two women resting on her lap. Could she have been a member of the local aristocracy? Archaeologists call the Gothic settlers of the Rubieszów Depression the Masłomianj group. They were one of the many Gothic peoples inhabiting places from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The biggest part of the Polish territories was inhabited by Vandal tribes alongside the Goths and their relatives, the Gepids. Baltic tribes lived in what's now Masuria, and Burgundians inhabited the basin of the Oder. The masters of these territories were mainly Germanic tribes, ancestors of modern-day Germans. There is no connection between these Germanic tribes, whose origins were Scandinavian, and the later development known as continental Germania, and now as Germany. They are simply two different cultural and historical phenomena. This relatively undisturbed development of the tribes in the Oder and Vistula basins in the first centuries AD would suddenly collapse. In the late 4th century, something happened in southeastern Europe that would affect the people of these parts too. In 375, the Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia, appeared on the steppes around the Black Sea coast. Like the Scythians and Sarmatians before them, the Huns spread terror and wreaked havoc. They crushed the Ostrogoths and moved on. The Goths, Vandals, and other barbarian tribes, including those on the Polish territories, started to flee to the southwest. That's how the migration period began and lasted for 200 years. In this period, we observe an intensified rate of migration and population movement. It was a time we could call a barbarian tsunami. The barbarians fleeing from the Huns started to encroach on the borders of the Roman Empire. In 476, after many years of fighting, the Western Roman Empire fell. The tribes from the Polish territories played a key role in the fall of the Roman Empire and its later resettlement. What was going on in those turbulent times on the current Polish territories? We get interesting information from the biological sciences. The plant pollen that settles in the sediments of lakes and peat bogs tells us a lot about the history of the local vegetation. The research paleobotanists have conducted in central and northern Poland shows that starting from the mid-5th century, there was a considerable fall in crop farming here, and the region was reforested. It must have been depopulated. The written records confirm this and say it was a land with no settlements.
Doszło tutaj do
The local inhabitants abandoned the region. Most of them simply left.
Po prostu wyniosły stąd w ogromnej większości.
This might have been due to the bad climate conditions that afflicted Europe about the mid-6th century. There were very strong volcano eruptions with clouds of dust, which scientists say had a cooling effect on the climate and caused drought. In addition, epidemics of plague decimated the inhabitants. All this could have contributed to the depopulation of the Oder and Vistula basins. Were there any exceptions, places where settlement continued? The exceptions were some parts of Kujavia, the estuary of the Vistula, and perhaps of the Oder as well. The names of the rivers, such as the Oder and the Vistula, are old European hydronyms, but someone must have remembered them and handed them down. So that's pretty clear proof that some people stayed there. Was it the descendants of the Celts, the Vandals, the Goths, and others who lived here earlier? If so, then why did they suddenly forget their previous skills? You can see this from the ceramics made in the 6th and 7th centuries, in many ways much poorer than the specimens produced here before. Very primitive indeed. These vessels were molded by hand without the use of a potter's wheel and poorly fired. Does that mean the region was settled by a new people not as skilled as their predecessors? New settlers arrived in the southeast of modern Poland probably in the 6th century. They were the Slavs, and groups of them came from the east. From where exactly? Today, we can say that the original home of the Slavs was in the forests of the upper and middle Dnieper river basin. The border zone of modern Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. The Slavic expansion started after the mid-5th century, when the fertile lands of today's southern Ukraine were left empty after the fall of the Lekhite Empire. The first wave of Slavic migration went there and settled. They did not find the lands of what is now Poland so attractive, but in the 6th century, some of them settled here too. Did they settle the entire Oder and Vistula basin at once? For quite some time, the Slavs did not venture into western or central Poland, not to mention the north of the country. The clues indicating that the Slavic settlement of Poland was slow come from archaeological research. Some of the earliest vestiges of communities thought to be Slavic are the remains of their cottages, which show that these farmers lived in small settlements. Unlike their predecessors, the Slavs tended to live in semi-sunken dwellings. They had a floor space of about 20 square meters. In one corner of their small, congested cottage, they had a stove, the focus of family life. This is an absolutely different picture from what we had earlier on the present-day territory of Poland. Yet some scholars doubt whether the Slavs, a fairly insignificant people in the 5th century, could have suddenly been vigorous enough to settle half of Europe. We're back to the dispute whether the Slavs came to the lands on the Oder and Vistula in the 6th century or whether they had been there all the time since the Bronze Age. Professor Janusz Piątek of the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań is in favor of the latter theory. For years, he's been looking at differences between the Western Slavs, including the Poles, and Eastern Slavs, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, who must have been their kindred if they all came from the East in the 6th century. His results show that the faces of Eastern Slavs are broader and shorter than those of Western Slavs.
Jak to możliwe?
How was it possible for such large differences to evolve over 15, 16, or 17 generations?
Do wykształcenia się tak dużych różnic morfologicznych. Otóż
there can only be one answer. These people must have lived for a longer time in their original domicile. Professor Piątek says the Poles did not belong to the people who came from the East, 6th century, but had lived here for ages. Will the dispute on the origin of the Poles ever be resolved? In the present century, geneticists joined the debate and started to examine samples from skeletons in ancient burial grounds and compare them with the DNA of today's population. We know that males inherit Y chromosomes from their fathers. Y chromosomes come in different haplogroups. In Poland, the most common haplogroup is R1a, which 50 to 60% of all Polish men have. Did R1a occur in the people living in the Slavs' hypothetical land of origin on the borders of present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia? We don't have any results yet for the time from the Bronze Age to the medieval period. One reason is that bones are not very well conserved in the soils there, which makes finding such materials very difficult. Another reason is that right up to the early Middle Ages, most of these people cremated their dead. The want of bone material for genetic research on that period is a problem applicable to the territory of modern Poland, too. And what if we find individuals from prehistoric times who had the R1a haplogroup? Would that give a final answer to the question of the origin of the Poles? Is there such a thing as a Slavic gene? All we can do is to determine the most common genetic pattern of inheritance, but that would only tell us that a given individual might have looked like a Slav, which does not necessarily mean that he definitely was a Slav. In the march of diverse peoples passing through the lands on the Oder and Vistula, it's hard to pinpoint the ancestors of the Poles. Master Vincentius made an attempt in his Chronicle of Poland, and later many fans of Poland's prehistory, including the makers of the Great Lekhite idea, tried too. Their visions were a mix of real events from the distant past with a good deal of fiction. I'm an archaeologist, so I have to keep strictly to the facts. If I don't have any facts, I have nothing at all to say, and there are no facts. I'll put it straight. There's absolutely no evidence to show that there were any well-organized groups here, let alone a state, before, say, the mid-9th or 10th century, which is when the state ruled by the Piast dynasty emerged. Slavic or not, all the peoples that once lived on the territory of present-day Poland are part of Polish history. We don't know how much of that past the mysterious Piast dynasty cherished in their memory. But that was the foundation on which Prince Mieszko built his 10th century state, which gave rise to Poland.